Welcome to the Everyday Warrior podcast, where we talk free to break free. As someone who's been told they talk too much, can speak with a mouthful of marbles, and might just be able to sell ice to Eskimos, I have found the perfect space to speak my truth and dive into deep conversations. This podcast is about celebrating everyday warriors, the people who face life's challenges head on, breaking through obstacles to build resilience, strength, and courage. Join me, your host, Trudy Marie, as I sit down with inspiring individuals who have fought their own battles and emerged stronger, sharing raw, real, and authentic stories that make you laugh, cry, debate, wonder, intrigue, feel all the emotions, and get curious about life with. This is a safe space to explore, question, and find your own path to new possibilities. Let us all embrace the warrior within and realise that while no one is walking in your shoes, others are on the same path, journeying through life together. If you're looking for an inspiring story of resilience, healing, and rediscovering yourself, my book, Everyday Warrior, is for you. It's my memoir of hiking the 1,000-kilometre Bibbulmun Track, a journey that was as much about finding my way back to myself as it was about conquering the trail. Through the highs, lows, and everything in between, this book shares my raw and honest experience of overcoming trauma and embracing the strength within. Grab your copy now. Just head to the link in the show notes and let's take this journey together. Love the Everyday Warriors podcast? You can support the show for as little as $5 with a one-time donation or by becoming a monthly subscriber. Your contribution helps me continue bringing you inspiring stories of everyday warriors who overcome challenges to find strength, resilience, and new possibilities in life. Head to the link to buy me a coffee and fuel the next episode. Every bit counts. Please note that the following podcast may contain discussions or topics that could be triggering or distressing for some listeners. I aim to provide informative and supportive content, but understand that certain themes may evoke strong emotions or memories. If you find yourself feeling overwhelmed or in need of support while listening, I encourage you to pause the podcast and take a break. Remember that it is okay to prioritise your well-being and seek assistance from trained professionals. There is no shame in this. In fact, it is the first brave step to healing. If you require immediate support, please consider reaching out to Lifeline on 13 11 14 or a crisis intervention service in your area. Thank you for listening, and please take care of yourself as you engage with the content of this podcast. Welcome to another episode of the Everyday Warriors podcast. And today it is another solo episode as I give you part 3 of my series of working with WA Police. And I start today's episode transitioning from the booze bus to my first station as a probationer. So you don't get to choose where you go as a probationer. You are literally sent an email with a transfer notice that says, this is where you'll be going next. And then you're given a time that's basically coordinated between the two senior sergeants of the place you are now and the place you're going to, as to when that's going to happen. And it's normally about a 2-week transition. So my first station was Northwest Metro Response. Now, at the time, WA Police was divided into 2 distinct divisions. You had your response team that would attend all jobs as they come in, and then you'd have your inquiry team, and they would do any follow-up on jobs, any warrants, any investigation-style processes as part of that. And in physical, how that worked was that the district had a series of stations in it, and then when there would be the district capital, I suppose, where that was the major station that the response team would work out of, and then the inquiry teams would work out of all the smaller stations. So further to that, for those people who know Perth, you've got north of the river, south of the river, and the eastern suburbs. And I was sent to northwest, meaning I was north of the river, but that was divided into two. So the inner circle was Mirrabooka, which was anything kind of north of the city up to around that Mirrabooka area. And then you had Joondalup, which looked after everything further north. For me, it was going into an area that I was very familiar with. I had literally grown up in my high school years in the Northwest Metro. I lived 10 minutes from the station, which was Mirrabooka. That had its own drawbacks though, because you had to live and work in the same district. So you had to be very careful when you were off duty. I was also always very mindful of who I might run into. But the good thing for me is being a single parent with two teenagers, living 10 minutes from the station meant that I was also 10 minutes from home should anything go wrong with my kids. The other thing that made it quite easy was that being my backyard and being so familiar with the area, I was able to drive P2, priority 2, and navigate the area really easily because I knew back roads, I knew side roads, I knew all the major arteries of where to go in the suburbs. So I was only getting closer to the actual job address location that I would then have to get some assistance or provide assistance. But prior to that, I didn't need a map. I could pretty much say where we were going. And that was really, really useful because it allowed me then to focus on all the other parts of the job. I didn't have to concentrate on where I was driving and how I was driving as well. I started on my team with a new sergeant, so a newly promoted sergeant, and there was also somebody else from my squad on my team. So I had a familiar face again, but everybody else was obviously an experienced police officer. There was a combination of first class and senior connies, which made it really good for a learning background as to the depth of knowledge and the experience that I was going to learn from. We also worked with a sister team, so two teams that worked the same roster, but with two different sergeants. And how that would actually work is you would primarily work with your own team and with your own sergeant, but should there be people off sick or people off on annual leave or anything like that, you would double up with those particular people. And so, you know, for one shift, you might end up working with somebody from the other team. But again, that gave you really good depth and insight into how different people worked. So overall, it was a pretty enjoyable experience. During that time, I also got to proudly march with the Anzac Parade with WA Police as part of the 100 Years of Women in Policing. So there was a very large contingency of females called to march that year, and I proudly wore my uniform, attended the dawn service at Kings Park, and then went and marched in the parade. So that is one memory that I do take from that period. I also became involved with a union, and I actually became the secretary of the Mirrabooka branch, and that really allowed me to understand the working conditions of WA Police, what we were allowed to do, what we weren't allowed to do, how rostering worked, how rostering changes worked, meal times, all the bits and pieces, and gain an understanding about that. And I really got to respect some of the officers who'd been around a while as well that were union reps to understand how that part of the workforce operated. I also took the opportunity during this period to do some further study where I could. So I remember doing a mental health first aid course, which was back up at the academy. And I also completed my level 1 human source training as a way to speak to potential people, not so much as an informant like the movies, but it's a way of actually speaking and getting information people by asking the right questions. So I found that really useful as well. And I also attended a number of different events, either up at the academy or around the local area, where you got to kind of speak with, it could be somebody from outside WA Police as a special guest keynote speaker, or from one of the inspectors, superintendents, assistant commissioners, whatever the case may be, but you got to learn from that perspective. And I found that really informative as well. And that was just me, I suppose, as a mature recruit, that I wasn't just interested in learning the basics. I wanted to know every aspect, including from a management level, because that's the world I'd operated in prior. So this was my way of kind of applying that, because let's be real, in a paramilitary style situation or workforce, there is no credibility for what you've done in the past. It's very much you're a probationer, then you're a connie, then you're a first class constable, then you're a senior constable, and then you have to apply for a promotion as a sergeant. And so it doesn't matter what your experience is prior, you all start from the same level and work your way up. So this was my way of actually putting some of my management experience in and just keep applying the knowledge and keep on doing that kind of thing. I had a really good team. Like, the sergeant I had was quite knowledgeable. He still had a lot to learn as a sergeant, so to speak, but as a police officer, he was very knowledgeable. And the team I worked with were extremely knowledgeable as well. And they were very accommodating, because it was a different age group of guys, different backgrounds, different experiences, and they were super accommodating to me to teach me the ropes, and I really valued that. However, there was one female on the team, only a few years older than me, and her and I had a personality difference from the get-go, and I looked at it from the perspective that she treated me like I was a 20-year-old probationer who knew nothing about the world and was trying to put her influence of the job onto me. She never took into account that I was actually a similar age to her. I had kids at home. I had worked for 20 plus years in the corporate world, and I had my own wealth of knowledge and experience coming into the job. And she constantly tried to undermine me. She put me down. She would kept changing my incident reports. So back in the day, as part of your probationary book and doing the work, you would have to have all your incident reports checked over. And she was the only one who would ever make changes. Everybody else in my team commended me for my quality of writing. And that was not hard for me, because I'd come out of this corporate world of having to write administrative reports and things like that. So that wasn't foreign, but every single time with her, she would literally try to change me. She would gaslight me. And it got to the point where she literally threw me under the bus. She went to the sergeant and he called me into the office about a situation. And I said to him, I asked his permission to speak to him freely, not as a probationer and a sergeant, and said, this is a personality clash. She doesn't like me and she is trying to undermine me. I said, have you had complaints from any of my other team members? And he said, no. And I said, so what is the actual issue here? Because for me, coming into this job, I come from 15 years of managing and HR and doing all that kind of thing. I know how these situations play out. And right now, she's just trying to take the upper hand as the senior connie with experience over the probationer, forgetting that I have life experience coming in with me. So I said to him, look, if it's going to make it easier, she actually liked working with the guys anyway. I said, don't put us on together unless absolutely necessary, because it's going to make things harder for her. It's going to make things harder for me. And why have that kind of conflict on your team if it's not necessary? And that was a really difficult one to navigate, because she was the first person who just really made it hard, for no other apparent reason than she didn't like me for whatever reason. But the rest of the guys on my team were amazing, and I had some really great times and experiences with them. There were lots and lots and lots and lots of jobs. If I had to look at that kind of 12-month period of being on response, you are literally tasked every night to just attend jobs. And you'd lose track of how many you attended in a night, and you were going from one end of the district to the other end of the district. You barely had time to breathe. But I loved the fast pace of it. I loved the fact that you didn't know what you were getting into, and we could just do various different things. But I will go over some of the jobs that I do actually remember. But one thing before I do that is I want to point out that going back to the P2 driving and driving in my area, I still to this day, and I was only in Perth recently, and I cannot drive down some of those roads without thinking, oh my God, I remember driving P2 through here during peak hour. And there is so many dangerous situations that you can be put into within driving at priority, because it's lights and sirens. You need to get there, and you're dealing with stupid traffic who do not pay attention to first responders, whether that's ambulances, fire department, or police. They don't don't check their rear vision mirrors. They don't listen out for sirens. They just have no clue as to what's going on around them. And when you then have to drive contraflow, meaning you're driving up the wrong side of the road in peak hour traffic because you have to get around the traffic, yeah, there were a few hair-raising moments. And driving through the suburb, I still remember various situations that I had to drive along. But one of the first jobs I did have to attend going to response was an attempted suicide by hanging. And we were called to the job as a welfare check, and I was with one of the guys on my team. And when we arrived, there actually was 2 traffic cops because they were close by and they'd heard the call as well and decided to attend. Not a usual occurrence for traffic cops, but when there's a danger to life, traffic will step in. Yeah, it involved a guy trying to take his life at the front of the property on his father's boat. And the 3 guys were trying to hold him up to loosen the knot. And I remember having to pull out a Leatherman, which I'd been given as a graduation present from my dad because he said it's always a useful tool. And that particular night, it was, because the 3 other guys had no such tool on their belt. And my Leatherman is what actually cut that gentleman down and helped to save his life. I then had to deal with the mother, who was not in a great condition, and also call the father home from work. And as a young probationer who didn't really know what she was doing, this was all going from the booze bus to this full-on frantic, serious job type situation, I was thrown in the deep end. And it was life experience that had me remain calm and poised and in control and just methodically go about doing what I needed to do. And one of the traffic cops was actually so impressed with how I handled that situation. An email was sent through a couple of days later as a commendation, which was added to my management file. And starting out, I felt really chuffed. It wasn't that I needed the validation, but knowing that I helped somebody in a really traumatic situation was good to know that I had done the right thing, because this was all foreign. It was all new to me. During the time I was at Northwest Metro, I also attended a number of sudden deaths, and these aren't fun for any police officer in any situation, because you're not just dealing with the body, you are dealing with the family, the friends, the colleagues, whoever is around at the time. You're dealing with the paramedics of St. John's ambulance that are there and are normally the ones that sign over end of life. And it's really quite hard to be in that situation, to remain poised and in control, and do it with such grace and dignity that the family feel like they're being looked after in those situations. Now, I say lucky for me in the sense that a lot of the jobs that I initially attended in my first lot of sudden deaths were quite elderly people. And I'm talking over 70, 80 plus years of age, most with medical conditions, and kind of died in their sleep or died at home as a result of a heart attack or something. And this is not the case now, especially since what's happened in the world in the last 5 years. But going back nearly 10 years ago, you could apply to the local doctor. So when you attend a sudden death, you have to accumulate any drugs or any prescriptions or any details of any doctor that are around. And if you can see that there is a certain pattern of what has happened and why it's happened, you can ask the doctor for a death certificate, which means that police don't have to be involved in the death because it's not under any sort of untoward circumstances. It's a lot more dignified for the family as well, and that if the doctor would sign off with a death certificate, you could leave the family to arrange the funeral home on their own. And I did that for a lot of the first lot of sudden deaths that I went to the point where I actually had one of the senior connies say to me, "You must be like a death angel," because I have never in all my years of policing been able to get a death certificate. So the fact that you're constantly getting these death certificates is really rare. And I said, I don't know what it is, but I'm just here to help the family. One in particular that I do remember, because as I said, it's not fun having to deal with a deceased body, prepare it for the coroner, like tagging, removing jewellery, dealing with clothing, all that type of thing, as well as interviewing the family and taking statements from the family. But one in particular, I remember there was myself, the sergeant, and the other probie from my squad that we attended a sudden death together because we just happened to be 3 up that day. And it was a Italian or Greek family, I can't remember the nationality, but large family, and the daughter and husband arrived with their young daughter, and she didn't want to go inside without a husband because she wanted support, but they didn't want the little girl inside, and then they didn't want to leave one parent without, and they were wondering what to do. And I actually had met them outside because we knew that they were coming, and I said to them, "Look, you go in together and I'll entertain the little girl." And as a mother, I could kind of step into that mothering role. And so I took this little girl who had her backpack full of stuff, and we kind of just went around the back and sat in the backyard, and I read stories and I coloured in, and I was doing all these little activities with this young girl. I think she was about 4 or 5. And I did that the whole time that they were inside. Now, one, I could do that because there were already 2 officers inside. And I was just so grateful that I was able to gift the family that experience, in the fact that the daughter and her husband could go inside and deal what they had to deal with without having to worry about their daughter. And eventually, once they were done and the daughter was okay, like the daughter of the deceased person, the husband came out and got his daughter and was so appreciative of my handling of the situation so they could do what they had to do. And that's one that just sticks in mind with me in that particular time. I also remember while I was at Northwest Metro doing a drug raid on a grow house, and I always found that intriguing because I had nothing to do with drugs, drug paraphernalia or anything prior to joining WA Police. Like, I was an innocent good girl. But we got in one morning, I think it was a Saturday morning, and the sergeant and I started early, and we were asked straight away if we could go sit off this house. And all that meant is that we just had to basically, sit a few doors down from this house and make sure there was no coming or going on that particular house, waiting for whatever was going to happen afterwards. So we were waiting, and it's quite boring in the sense that you can't do anything. It's just you and another colleague in the car, but the sergeant and I got chatting and, talking about my probationary and our past and history and all that kind of thing. And we finally had another vehicle pull up, which was a detective vehicle. And he said, right, we're about to perform a warrant on this house and we need you guys to be involved. And then another detective car pulled up and another duty car pulled up. So between all of us, we had to dismantle this grow house. And it was an average 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom home in the middle of a suburb. And it looked kosher from the front, like well-maintained and neat. Out the back was a whole other story, like weeds, knee-high. But inside, it had various rooms of different sized cannabis plants that were being grown. There was a bed in the middle of the lounge room for obviously the person who looked after the house, and we had to literally dismantle it. And I am highly allergic to marijuana plants. Like, I itch from it and get hives from it straight away. So that wasn't fun either, having to, account for all these plants, bag them all up, like bag up all the equipment, like doing it all with evidence. Like, it took us the whole day, like the whole shift was dismantling that house. And I will never forget that, because I learned so much in that one day about how drugs are grown and cultivated and how grow houses work and what's involved with all of that, and seeing the plants at the different sizes, like, as, a young innocent person who has no clue to going, oh my God, this is how this works. That was a job that will stand out with me for a very, very long time. Another night I was working with my sergeant, we were called to a disturbance at a house, and when we got there, it was a group of Indigenous people and there was a bit of a commotion. And what we discovered being there was that there had been a death in the family and they were kind of mourning and drinking. And one particular family member was causing issues, and the main occupant of the house wanted this person removed, and that's what we were there for. But when you're dealing with a large group of drunk, sad people, it kind of makes things a little bit on edge. And we couldn't get to this particular person. Like, we couldn't really even get inside to find out where this person was. Anyway, I got talking to this young girl out the front trying to gather some information. And I happened to say to her, like, where are you from? And she said the goldfields. And so because I had grown up in the goldfields and I knew the situation up there, I was like, oh, so you guys are Wongai, identifying the native tribe. And she said, yeah, Wongai. And I said, yeah, I grew up in the goldfields. In fact, I, lived in Leonora, Laverton, Kalgoorlie. I know the area very well. So she happened to say to her dad, this cop knows Wongai. And he goes, oh, really? And so within a few minutes of having those conversations, the dad said to me, what are you here for? And I said, we've had a call from the occupant of the house. There is one particular person who is causing a disturbance and she would like them removed. And he said, give me 5. And I kid you not, that gentleman went inside, found the person who we were there for, had other people cooperate, and the next minute this guy was in the front yard with a backpack with his belongings, and we were given an address for him to go elsewhere. And the sergeant kind of looked, and he was about to call for backup because we didn't know how this was going to go. And he said, how did that happen? Like, he'd gone back to the car to radio potentially for support. And in the meantime, I had it all under control. And he said, what had happened? And I said, I just used my experience. I recognised that they were from the goldfields, they were Wongai, and I levelled with them. And I told them what we were there for, and they cooperated. And in that moment, I knew that I really had to see individuals for who they were and take each case as a one-off occasion. Like, it's no use comparing how other people behave. It's no use saying how people will behave as a general group of people. You really do need to listen and take on board what's going on in that circumstance. And that job really opened my eyes to how powerful that could be. Another job that actually caused me a little bit of trauma going home, and it's probably one of the first jobs apart from cutting this particular guy down when I first got there, but this job caused me a little bit trauma because of how close it hit home in the sense of being a mother. So I was required to attend a family domestic job between a mother and a child. And what had happened was the child was being abused. I don't think sexually, I think just physically, but I didn't know the full circumstances. And we were called by a neighbour because this child had actually sought safety at a neighbour's house. And unfortunately, we had to go and arrest the mother based on what the child was saying, and then take the child to the hospital to be checked and to wait for detectives who had child interview experience and hand the job over to them. But I also had to go back and compile any kind of list of incidents or any kind of history that I could get, any statements from other people to back up the claims of this child for the initial stage. Firstly, I just couldn't believe that somebody would actually do that to their child. I mean, you see the TV shows, you see the movies, but when you're not confronted with that in an everyday situation, you really start to see the dark side of society. And that's probably why that particular job sticks in my head, because as a mother, I could just not comprehend her doing that to her child. And for me, it was going home to my kids, even though my kids were much older, it was hugging them a little bit tighter and being thankful and grateful that they weren't exposed to such trauma, because I was like, what has that little kid got to live for or hope for when his own mother, the person who is supposed to love him and take care of him, is actually hurting him? And that was a really difficult pill to swallow. Yeah, I suppose my first real look at the darker side of society. We say that, you deal with the 1% of society, but it's even the darker side of that. So that wasn't very fun. The other job I do remember going to is the last one that I had to complete all the tasks in my probationary book. So I completed them all, I completed all the ones I could on the booze bus, and then as soon as I got to Northwest Metro, I completed all the jobs as necessary to get my probie book done. But there was just one I couldn't get, and it was an arrest, but it was quite distinctive in what I had to do. And I was just like, wow, all these response jobs are what I go to, and I just cannot get this arrest. Anyway, I spoke to my sergeant about it, and I ended up working on a day shift. I'd planned to work for the week if it worked out, because we were on day shift as well, but I'd planned to work with the inquiry team for that week to see if I could get one even via a warrant. So I remember my sergeant teeing it up with one of the inquiry teams, and I went out with one of the officers from that team on a particular day, and we had a handful of warrants arrest warrants that we had to try and deal with. And he's like, positive thoughts, one of these has to be around. And so when you do have an arrest warrant, you basically just go knock on doors until you can see if you can find the person. It doesn't always happen, but I think it was about the third or fourth person that we went to try. We approached a unit block, so multi-storey, multi-unit dwelling, and we approached the door really quietly because we wanted to hear what was going on inside. And we could hear multiple voices, and it didn't just sound like the TV, it sounded like a proper conversation. So we knew or had an idea that the person we were looking for was in the house. So we knocked on the door calling for police, and there was a little bit of you could hear what was going on in the background of like things going on. And the person who opened the door was a male, and he took his time getting there. So we're like, we're here to do arrest this person. We can come in looking for this person and trying to find this person. Now, we were on, I think, like, say, the third or fourth story of this apartment block. So the likelihood of the person escaping out the window was quite low. But obviously, we still checked the balconies and making sure they hadn't shimmied down or were hanging from beneath like you see in the movies. But we were trying to find, like, there was nobody there other than this guy. And I'm like, where is she? Because we heard multiple voices. He's like, no, it's the TV. And I said, it's definitely not the TV. She's here somewhere. So I literally went back to the front door, and my colleague was there as well looking, but we're into every room trying to find this person. And in the end, the only space available was the kitchen cupboards. And I was like, could she? Like, I had no idea what this person looked like other than a basic description from, the system. And I was like, let's try. And I kid you not, I opened the cupboards under the kitchen sink, and she was curled up in the fetal position with an empty cupboard. And I was just like, are you freaking kidding me? We could have walked out going, yep, there's no one here, and thinking it was the TV. But she had curled herself up into the fetal position under the kitchen sink to hide from police. And that cracked me up, because I was just like, oh my God, like, I cannot believe that. So yeah, she was arrested, and she was the person that finished my probie task book. On the other hand, I remember going to another job with a girl who was arrestable, and that was the first time I had a knife drawn on me. And it was very quick. It wasn't super serious in hindsight, which I'll explain, but it was a heightened event, which I think was one of the first kind of issues where I really felt unsafe, and how quickly the events could turn. So 2 cars from my team, so 4 of us, the other female officer and 2 of the guys, and we had to attend this house to look for this arrestable person. We went through the house, and we couldn't find her. And I was like, she's here somewhere. I've just got to find her. And in that case, I was like, I found her in a robe, in a built-in robe. And I slid the door open, and she was there sitting again in kind of the seated position with her knees up around her and like being as small as possible. And I said, we've got you. You just need to get out. So because of the mess in the room, I closed that door, and we opened the other door to get her out. And so I had like slid the door open and was about to stand there. But the other female officer, who was standing a bit back and behind me, was like, could see kind of more clearly as she came forward. And as she came forward, she was armed with a steak knife. Now, in the big scheme of things, a steak knife is not a big, super sharp knife, but it has a pointy end, and it can do some real damage if it was used in a stabbing motion. And the female officer's like, she's got a knife. And literally, one of the guys I worked with, he pushed me out of the way, like literally almost threw me back against the wall, and came out with his taser drawn and said, like, drop the knife. And the other male officer come in, he was the same, and literally arrested her and disarmed her from the knife. I think she actually dropped it. But I was just like, I had no clue that in a split second of me closing one end of the wardrobe and opening the other, that things could turn so pear-shaped. I was just like, oh my God, like, that was such a close call. Not that anything happened, but I think in your mind, it's like, wow, how did I even not see that as a possibility? How did I even go that close to the situation? Like, everything is rolling on in my head and turning over and over and over about this potential knife attack. As it was, we arrested her and dealt with her, and no further incident. But it just went to prove like how how dangerous and volatile the job I'd gotten myself into, this career as a police officer, could actually go on a day-to-day, minute-by-minute process. You could never be prepared for what could happen. Across the board, like, my time at Northwest Metro Response was really educational. Like, we attended everything from, actually, that brings back another memory, because I also attended my first fatal car accident. It was in the city, peak hour traffic, motorbike v car. I just thank God that I didn't have to actually see the accident scene up close. I, probably for my own benefit, went, I don't need to be that close. I could see what was going on, but I didn't want to be up close and personal with it. And I'm like, I'm directing traffic. So I took myself out of the equation and went and directed traffic. But then I had to be involved because the officer I was working with had arrested the motor vehicle driver, and under the Road Traffic Act, you need to take them for a blood test to the hospital. We had to go to the hospital for the driver to have blood tests taken as part of the whole situation, to check for any alcohol or drugs in the blood as part of the accident. Yeah, kind of having to deal with that, knowing that this person had literally just killed somebody else as part of an accident, and be in that process of arresting her, going through the process at the hospital, taking the blood, and then going back to deal with everything, was super hard. Like, it's not an easy job to know that regardless of what this person's done, what they potentially could or couldn't be on, that's a life-changing moment for anybody. Like, you cannot go back in time and undo that. Yeah, the motorbike driver, it was fatal, and she had to now live with the fact that she had killed somebody in a motor vehicle accident. Dealing with that was a tough one. So I take my hands off to traffic and to major crash, and the colleagues who have to actually attend that on a regular occurrence, I honestly don't know how they do it, because I've had people I know involved in serious car accidents and in fatal car accidents, and yeah, even having to deal with the family afterwards and to explain it, it's not a fun situation to be in. That takes a toll on your own mental health and what you see. Like, you can't unsee certain things. So apart from that, my time at Northwest Metro Response was very educational. Throw me in the deep end, give me a taste of what this career I've chosen is going to be like, going from job to job to job and learning as much as I could. Like, I was like a sponge, absorbing everything. I don't know how many arrests or briefs or incidents, field reports, whatever I did during that time. It really did set me up for what would happen next when I went to my next station. So we don't operate in that situation anymore. It was a very special time for me to be able to experience that, and that was my last position as a probationer before I stepped into being a fully sworn constable. Thank you for tuning in to the Everyday Warriors podcast. If you have an idea for a future episode or a story you'd like to share yourself, then please message me, as I am always up for real, raw, and authentic conversations with other everyday warriors. If you love what you are hearing, please be sure to subscribe and hear all the latest episodes, and spread word to your family, friends and colleagues so they can listen in too. If you are sharing on social media, please be sure to tag me at _Trudy_Marie_ so I can personally acknowledge you. I am always open to comment about how these episodes have resonated with you, the listener. It would also mean the world to me if you were to leave a 5-star review to ensure that the Everyday Warrior podcast is heard by more listeners around the world. And remember, lead with love as you live this one wild and precious life.